We have a quorum for our meeting of Thursday, June 3rd. This is the Transportation Committee of SACOG. So welcome everyone to this remote meeting. It's a pleasure to have you all with us here today. We are going to start off with a Pledge of Allegiance. And let's see, Mr. Joyner, you were just at a presidential site. Why don't you lead us in the pledge?
I'd be happy to. If you'll all please stand and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you very much. Roll call, please.
Yes, absolutely. And before I give roll call, I'm just going to go over a few meeting tips for this morning. Just as you heard earlier, this meeting is being recorded and it will be available to view on SACOG's website after the meeting. For any members of the public tuning in today and who wish to make a comment, you can notify us by selecting raise hand or by pressing *9 if calling in by phone. All public comment will be limited to 3 minutes each. And to help with timing, I will give the speaker 1 minute warning. Lastly, for our committee members, please remember to stay on mute until you're ready to speak to help eliminate any background noise. And when you are ready to speak, please use the raise hand feature or press *9 if phoning in to alert the chair. All right, please prepare to respond when I call your name. Director Bradford.
Here.
Thank you. Director Branscombe.
Here.
Thank you. Director Desmond.
Here.
Thank you. Director Ledesma for Guerrero. Absent. Director Jennings.
Here.
Director Joyner.
Here.
Director Saylor.
Here.
Director Chenier.
Here.
Vice Chair Sander.
Here.
Vice Chair Spokley. Absent. Chair Soon. Absent. Ex officio member Fong for Benepal.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the time for public communications. Any person wanting to address the committee on any item that is not on our agenda can do so at this time. We may limit testimony if there's an enormous amount of commentary that there usually is not. So, is there any public communications?
I have not received any public comment requests.
Okay. We are then going to adjourn as SACOG, and we are going to reconvene as the Capital Valley Regional Service Authority for Freeways and Expressways Committee. That is a separate agenda. And I have to pull that up myself. All right, so we have one item on consent and one item for action. Consent is item number 1. Does anyone wish to discuss? If not, I'm open to a motion.
This is Director Young. Just wanted to make sure that you know that I'm here from the Safe Board, because since we didn't do roll call, I'll add me to it. And otherwise, I'll make the motion too for the consent.
Actually, Madam Clerk, do we need to do roll call for CVR Safe?
Yes, Director Sander, let me take roll for those 2 members. I'll let the record show that attendance remains the same with the addition of Directors Nguyen and Young. Could you please indicate? Oh, let's hear from Director Nguyen. Are you present?
I am present. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, guys. Public communications we've already covered. Last call. If you want to comment on this particular agenda. All right, with that, we're moving on to consent calendar. Item number 1, open for a motion.
I move to approve. Director Young.
All right, is there a second?
Director Bradford will second.
Excellent. Roll call, please.
Director Bradford.
Aye.
Thank you. Branscombe.
Aye.
Desmond.
Aye.
Ledesma for Guerrero. Absent. Jennings.
Aye.
Joyner. Director Joyner, can you indicate your vote?
Aye.
Thank you. Saylor,
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Wynn,
Yes.
Young,
Yes.
Vice Chair Sander,
Aye.
Vice Chair Spokely, absent. Chair Soon, absent. Motion passes.
All right, that takes us to the action item on number 2. This is about the CVR Safe fiscal year 2021-2022 budget. And Barbara, I think you have a presentation for us.
I do have a presentation for you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Barbara von Bechtold. I'm the Capital Valley Regional Service Authority for Freeways and Expressways Program Manager. And today we're going to briefly talk about the CVR Safe budget for fiscal year 21-22. Staff has developed for your approval and recommendation to the CVR Safe Board the final fiscal year 21-22 CVR Safe budget. So a little background, the CVR Safe is comprised of El Dorado, Sacramento, San Joaquin, Sutter, Yolo, and Yuba counties. The revenues for the CVR Safe are collected through a $1 fee. This is assessed at the time of vehicle registration in the participating counties. And the CVR Safe bylaws require that a budget be approved before July 1st of each fiscal year. We released the draft fiscal year 21-22 CVR Safe budget following the May 20th, 2021 CVR Safe board meeting. And at this time, we've received no comments on the draft budget that was released. The final budget we have as part of your item has not been changed at all since you saw it back in May. Based on our budget forecast, the CVR Safe has enough funds in during the year to continue to cover all costs for existing services as well as enhanced service expenditures as shown in attachment A. And finally, it is required the CVR Safe budget acknowledge that the cost sharing of vehicle registration funds from the 3 donor counties with excess revenues are still needed to cover a portion of the projected over expenditures in the 3 other member counties. These 3 recipient counties generate a relatively low amount of vehicle license fee revenues to support the significant interregional travel they accommodate along the roadways. No service reductions in the fiscal year 21-22 budget will be needed in the donor counties to accommodate this cost sharing. So we ask that the CVR Safe Committee recommend to the CVR Safe Board to approve the adoption of the final fiscal year 21-22 budget for the CVR Safe. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Are there any questions for Barbara?
Yeah, Director Wynn, real quick, and just an aside, the budgeting amount set aside for an intern, have we not had one because there aren't any available, or is it because of COVID?
We didn't have one last year because of COVID. There was a delay in some of the ITS work that we do every year, but they'll have an expanded role this year, and so we'll have a ITS intern this year.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right, I'm available for a motion.
Director Wynn, move to approve.
Director Young seconds.
Great, motion made and seconded. Roll call, please.
Directors Bradford,
Aye.
Branscombe,
Aye.
Desmond,
Aye.
Ledesma, absent. Jennings,
Aye.
Joyner,
Aye.
Saylor,
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Wynn,
Yes.
Young,
Yes.
Vice Chair Sander,
Aye.
Vice Chair Spokely, absent. Chair Soon, absent. Motion carries.
Very good. I think that completes the business of CVR Safe. I thank Directors Young and Wynn for your attendance. Glad you didn't
Thank
have
you.
too long of a drive here this morning.
You're right.
Chair Sander, if I could, before we say goodbye to our CVR Safe directors, at the full board meeting, obviously this item will come before the full board June 17th, but we're going to have a graduation for all of you, but for the 2 of you as well, of our Youth Leadership Academy. This is something that Director Chenier really led the start of about 3 years ago. We're wrapping up this year. We'll have a graduation. You'll see that before we actually get into your item at the full board meeting, but we'd love to have you come, and we're very proud of that. And so just a heads up for all of you in terms of that graduation and for those two directors, Director Nguyen, Director Young. So looking forward to it.
Thank you for the invitation. So it will be in person?
No, this will be all virtual. Our June 17th board meeting.
It will still be virtual. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. All right,
Okay.
thanks.
Couple of weeks. See you then.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, guys. So we are going back to our Transportation Committee agenda and the consent calendar there. So this is items 1 through 3 on our regular SACOG Transportation Committee agenda. So anyone wish to pull an item for discussion? If not, I am available for a motion.
Joyner moves approval.
Desmond seconds. Second.
All right, motion made and second. Roll call, please.
Directors Bradford,
Aye.
Branscombe,
Aye.
Desmond,
Aye.
Ledesma,
Aye.
Jennings,
Aye.
Joyner,
Aye.
Saylor.
Aye.
Thank you. Chenier,
Aye.
Vice Chair Sander,
Aye.
Vice Chair Spokely, absent. Chair Soon, absent. Motion carries.
All right, very good. That brings us to item number 4. First of the 2 action items on our agenda. And let's see, we have Barbara up again for this one. So it's FTA, the American Rescue Plan Act, stimulus funding earned share programming for the SACOG region.
All right, good morning again, everyone. I'm back. We're going to talk about our Federal Transit Administration American Rescue Plan Act stimulus funds, the funding being programmed using our earned share process, which we have talked to you about previously. Back in March 11th of this year, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law, with the FTA being allocated $30.5 billion to recipients of transit funds in urbanized areas as well as rural areas. In the SACOG region, the American Rescue Plan Act transit funding includes $117 million for the Sacramento urbanized area. It's shown in attachment A. SACOG's programming of these stimulus funds is focused on those formula funds that come to the Sacramento urbanized area. So since last year, SACOG's been actively coordinating with all of our transit agencies and community-based transportation providers on the services that they're providing using stimulus funds for both the CARES Act as well as the CRISA. For the prior 2 rounds, the first 2 stimulus packages, the federal transit stimulus funding, the board was programmed with 100% of the funding using the service-based earned share methodology, where the funds are distributed based on the performance of the transit operators. Given the unique nature of the funding, the recommended change to the allocation methodology for this 3rd stimulus is to distribute 88%, which is our regular earned share percentage, of the American Rescue Plan Act through that basis. The remaining 12% of the funds will be programmed by a working group of the Sacramento urbanized area transit operators and human service nonprofit transportation providers later this summer. The one-time American Rescue Plan discretionary funding provides an opportunity to help fund early year next generation transit program strategies that also support the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, sustainable community strategy, transit policies. You can see in table 1 the breakdown of the funds that's based on that earned share methodology of the performance of each of the operators listed. With that, we're asking that the Transportation Committee recommend to the board to authorize the programming of the region's available American Rescue Plan Act funding to the Sacramento urbanized area. Again, just at 88% of the funding. And then also authorize programming of the additional funds. These funds come from 2 different, they're all FTA 5307 funds, but one of the sources is an FTA 5307 calculation that the Federal Transit Administration does. The other is FTA 5337, which are funds that are based on rail services, and Sacramento Regional Transit, as the only public transit rail operator in our area, we have programmed those funds to them as the only rail operator. And then to make the programming conditional on funding recipients continuing support of COVID-19 related transportation services in their service district, through at least the end of California's executive orders for the COVID-19 crisis. With that, I can answer any questions you might have about this item.
All right, any questions for Barbara? All right, seeing none, open for motion.
Joyner moves approval.
Bradford will second.
Motion made and seconded. Roll call, please.
Directors Bradford,
Aye.
Branscombe,
Aye.
Desmond,
Aye.
Ledesma,
Aye.
Jennings,
Aye.
Joyner,
Aye.
Saylor,
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Vice Chair Sander,
Aye.
Vice Chair Spokley, absent. Chair Soon, absent. Motion carries. And
Oh.
we did not receive any public comment on that item, just FYI.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
That brings us to action item number 5. That is delegation of authority for supplemental active transportation programming funding. And Victoria, I think you've got this report.
Yes,
and it
I
may
do.
be of an urgent nature.
It may be. Then again, it may not.
May not.
This is something that we are doing due to a lot of unknown factors right now, and also the known factor that the board will be on recess in July. There is a lot of discussion around possible one-time augmentation for active transportation program funding. You may remember active transportation program funding through an item that was approved by the SACOG board back in April. So just on April 15th, we very recently conducted a full competition for programs across the 6-county SACOG region for bicycle and pedestrian improvements and other programs that could help encourage and increase the number of people biking and walking. And now, right on the heels of that, there is a possibility of perhaps 500 million statewide, or perhaps more, perhaps less, perhaps none at all. Whatever the case, we are asking you to, if additional funding is included in the final budget that gets approved in June, if additional funding dedicated towards the active transportation program is approved and then also passed down to the region, we are asking that you request of the SACOG board that the August Transportation Commission be able to act on any final recommendations from the SACOG region of new projects that would get funding. This is the sort of thing that every time we conduct an active transportation program competition, we prepare for just in case. It came in handy when Senate Bill 1 was passed and we had a one-time influx of ATP funding that was between cycles. And this is another instance where our ranked contingency list, so the projects that were not able to be funded through our recent ATP competition, are in ranked order and they're waiting in line. They do not have any other funding that has been committed to them. So we would present those as part of the regional recommendation usually. And I say that because we don't know if new funding is available. We don't know what conditions the California Transportation Commission or Caltrans may place upon it. But if everything were to carry out as it's been conveyed through or by California Transportation Commission staff, we could receive additional funding at the region, and we would be expected to use our in-place contingency list, and we would be expected to give a final recommendation that could be approved at the August California Transportation Commission meeting. So I realize there are more ifs as part of this action than anybody can really keep track of. But this is really asking for the Transportation Committee to ask the board for delegated authority to make any action that might be needed in August using the already ranked contingency list and the process that we recently concluded. So in the attachments, you can see what our ranked prioritized contingency list is, along with the projects that were recommended for funding this most recent time. Since I do not have a funding estimate or a funding guarantee as part of this, I cannot tell you how far down the list we'd be able to go. It really depends on what number, if any, makes it into the final budget. But with that, I am happy to address any speculative questions that you may have to the best of my ability. And if it's beyond my ability, I will admit so.
All right, any questions? I see the CTC list is attached here. So, and it seems to line up with our contingency list. So what they're submitted was just included everything on our list, on our contingency list.
Their list did not include everything on our contingency list. There are a couple of projects that only applied to the region. The California Transportation Commission's original proposal is attached for reference, but is no longer the primary operating assumption.
Okay.
They initially asked for $2 billion and expected it to all be dedicated to the state funding competition, which would leave out projects such as the one from Sacramento County Regional Parks that applied just to the region, and then also Sacramento RT's grant application as well.
I see.
So they had that assumption going into this discussion, and that was part of their proposal, but it is now more likely tilting to that they would not dedicate all of the funding to the statewide competition and funding down their ranked list, but instead would use the typical split of funding going to MPOs for us to implement regional priorities.
Okay, any other questions? Very good, I'm open for, is there any public comment on this item? Seeing
Nope.
none, open for motion.
I move approval. Sailor seconds.
And who was the maker of the motion?
Ledesma.
All right,
Thank you.
motion made and seconded. Roll call, please.
Directors Bradford,
Aye.
Branscombe,
Aye.
Desmond,
Aye.
Ledesma,
Aye.
Jennings,
Aye.
Joyner,
Aye.
Saylor,
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Vice Chair Sander,
Aye.
Vice Chair Spokely, absent, Chair Soon, absent, motion carries.
All right, thank you.
Chair Sander, if I make a quick comment.
Sure.
As we get our guests ready here to talk about next generation transit. So the action you just took, and I know you're somewhat familiar in taking those actions, was about being ready, right? It was about actually being prepared that if we get money in the state budget, we are ready before the CTC meeting in August. And that's about a list and approval, and in some ways it's procedural. The other, I want to connect this to the item that you've heard a lot about on the Regional Parks and Trails Network, which Victoria will come back to you at the end of this meeting on. And in some ways, and we've told you this, but that Regional Trails Network and plan, really hopefully a vision, an exciting vision, is also about being ready, but being ready in a different way. Chair Sander, you mentioned the feds and Congress, and maybe they're doing something. Maybe something will happen. Well, just in the Senate EPW markup last week, an amendment was approved in a bipartisan fashion to add $1 billion for regional trail networks around the country who's ready out there, right? So I just want to connect some dots here on that's a different kind of being ready. And I think we should be first in line or in that first 5 or so as you again, you hear from Victoria a little bit later, and you're going to hear more about the trails plan getting developed. And I know there's a lot of interest across the region and across the board. But I want to connect the dots that it is in part of our own local plan, and we're building it from the ground up and from the local level up, but it is also about having something that is worthy of investment that we are ready for. Because I believe this is coming. I think these trail networks are going to pop. Anyway, just wanted to connect those dots for you. And hope that makes sense. And again, that's about Victoria's item that's going to come a little bit later, but now for next generation transit.
And I think Chris is up for this.
Yes, good morning, Vice Chair and members of the committee. Chris Doherty with the Transportation Group here at SACOG. Today we're seeking your feedback on a set of draft strategies that we are taking forward for the Next Generation Transit project. I'm joined today by my colleague Mike Rawson, who's co-managing the project with me, and our consultant team from ARUP, led by Autumn Bernstein. We are bringing these draft strategies to you today for your feedback, but we do anticipate that we will be coming to the board on the 17th with a draft plan for your review and a larger workshop to incorporate all that together. So we look forward to these as we're finishing up this project in its final steps as we're moving forward. And with that, I'll introduce Autumn, and she can take over for the presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be back with you this morning, and I appreciated James' comments about the regional trails network and how SACOG getting the region aligned for for opportunities that may be coming for funding at the federal level. And I really think that that's a nice segue into talking about this project, which is also, I think, similarly looking to see how do we create a regional vision for transit that then positions us for being able to secure additional funding to implement, really the next set of transit investments that need to happen in order to accommodate the growth that's coming in the region and make sure we're able to meet our the goals for economic development and land use that are envisioned in the MTPSCS. So with that, I'll go ahead and share a slide deck. And I know you received a lot of this information in your packet. It's a lot of information. I'm not going to go through all of these slides in great detail, but I'll kind of give a high-level overview, and then Chris and I will be available to answer questions on any of the specific strategies that you'd like more information on. Can everyone see my screen? All right, great. So, this deck, as Chris alluded to, provides our strategy recommendations for the Next Generation Transit Study. We've been working on this for about 6 months now. We've had a technical advisory committee and policy advisory committee that's been meeting regularly. So they've actually now seen kind of 2 iterations, 2 bounces of a high-level set of strategies. And in addition, we've had a set of interviews with key stakeholders in April, including many of the transit operators, as well as members of our policy advisory committee that includes business groups, community leaders, a variety of different stakeholders with an interest in transit. And just to say as we get in that this is this set of strategies is not a work plan for SACOG, nor is it a mandate for transit operators or anyone else for that matter. This is a vision. This is a plan that will require effort. It will require funding, but this is really kind of an all hands on deck. How do we move transit from some of the real difficult, challenging places that it was in even before COVID? How do we make sure transit recovers from COVID, and pivots to become the system that we need going forward? And it's very much an effort that's going to require collaboration across the board. So just to remind you all of the context, you have an adopted MTPSCS that envisions some impressive growth. And what we've seen, of course, with the last year or so, as COVID has upended everything, we've seen that in some ways that growth has really accelerated with kind of in-migration to the region, some very big demographic changes happening. And the MTPSCS really lays out a vision for new housing and jobs to be located near transit, because quite frankly, the capacity doesn't exist in the roadway network to serve all this growth if we continue to have most of the travel in the region, the vast majority, happening by people driving alone. So in order to achieve this vision, the question we were trying to answer with the study is, how does the region's transit network need to change? Now, this project was scoped before COVID, but COVID, I would say, just really put a finer point on it, because not only do we want to grow and expand the transit network, we have to make sure it withstands the significant disruptions that we've seen in the last year. So we identified a vision statement that we've been working with stakeholders to refine, and it's here. And I'll just note that this is really all about making transit competitive with driving. It's about addressing the very real mobility disparities that we see, particularly for low-income and transit-dependent groups in the region. It's about, as I just talked about, enabling the MTPSCS land use vision. And we know that there's a lot of new technology out there that can really help improve the user experience and bring people back to transit who may have felt that it didn't really work for them in the past. So we did an existing conditions analysis that found a couple of key issues with the existing transit system that we think are really central, that we're working to address through this project. The first is that transit trips take 4 to 6 times longer than comparable vehicle trips in the region, and that disparity is bigger than we see in other comparable regions, and it creates a significant disadvantage for transit in terms of attracting or retaining riders. That if people have another option, why would they take 4 to 6 times longer to get where they need to go? The second piece, and it's related to this, is that our transit system is not really a regional system currently. It is a set of local systems that are designed and managed and operated to meet the needs of local travelers. But increasingly, again, with some of the growth and demographic changes we've seen, people are traveling further and further from where they live in order to get to work. In part, they're doing that in response to housing prices. And so as people's commutes get longer, as more and more people cross county lines to get to work, we need a system, a transit network that really is focused on those trips and is thinking about the needs of those travelers. And currently that is not happening. And then third, existing land use patterns make it really difficult to deliver effective transit, because transit relies on density and it relies on walkability. And so the MTPSCS does envision some significant changes in land use that will make transit more effective. But really, this is these two things need to go hand in hand. We both need to visualize the transit system of the future, and at the same time, make sure that we are shifting the way land use is happening in the region in order to facilitate transit. So as we get into the strategies, just a bit more detail on some of this, some of our findings. There is just this tremendous shift happening right now with rising home prices and COVID that are just significant disruptors. There's a lot that we know, but there's also a lot that we don't know. And the next couple of years are going to be a critical time for understanding how user behavior is changing, where people are going, how often they're commuting, how far they're commuting, et cetera. So there's just a lot that we don't know. And so a big piece of what you're going to hear about is how do we really understand what the user needs are, particular users that have long trips across county lines, and how do we make sure we're planning for them? Funding is always a challenge, but there are new sources on the horizon, and we really believe it takes money to make money. We need to think beyond our existing resource constraints if we're going to be positioned for new funding. As I talked about, riding transit is frankly just too slow right now. And there are some things that the transit operators can do about this, but it's also really about infrastructure and about how we manage our streets and highways. And that means that cities, right-of-way managers, Caltrans, counties, all have a role to play in making sure that buses aren't sitting in traffic, because we can't speed up transit if the buses are sitting in traffic. And then on mobility disparities, our analysis did find that large disparities do remain, despite the fact that many of the region's low-income communities are located near transit. Because transit is so slow, And because many transit dependent folks don't have access to a car, they are experiencing some of the longest travel times compared to others in the region. And so really figuring out how to speed up transit and give people in those communities more opportunities to more alternatives if transit just isn't getting them where they need to go, needs to be a key focus. And this map, I think, provides some really important context. Historically, the transit network in the Sacramento region has been very much oriented towards downtown Sacramento as the main job center. But we know that increasingly that jobs are not just located in downtown Sacramento anymore. And so what we did is we did an analysis of trip data to look at the top 10 destinations outside of downtown Sacramento. And interestingly, we found that downtown Sacramento accounts for just about 2% of trips overall in the region. And what you see is places like Rancho Cordova, Folsom, Roseville, Elk Grove, Davis, Woodland. These are the other major destinations in the region. And what this really points to is the fact that, we can no longer have a system that is just oriented towards downtown Sacramento. We truly need a multi-nodal system, multi-destinational network that allows people to get from Roseville to Davis, or from Rancho Cordova to Elk Grove, or from Woodland to Folsom, because those are the trips that people are making. And right now our current system just frankly isn't designed to address those trips. So the 4 focus areas that we have identified, these are the 4 buckets, if you will, of strategies that we feel need to be addressed in order to shape this next generation transit system are the user experience, planning and funding, transit design and delivery, and then a kind of cross-cutting recommendation in green around reducing mobility disparities. That really, the recommendations here kind of apply across the board to all the other activities and strategies we'll be discussing. So there's a lot of information on these next slides. I'm not going to go into all the details, just high level, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of the details here when we get to Q&A. But the user experience is about kind of 3 main areas. It's about kind of making it more simple so that even though we have 8 different transit operators behind the scenes, that it feels like one system to the user, so that they don't have to worry about, who's operating service area am I in. They just say, I need to get from A to B, and here's how I pay for it, and here's how I can plan that trip. So having a cohesive user interface, if you will, so that riders are able to just navigate a single system. The second area of comfortable is just around making kind of vehicles, stations, and stops kind of easy and straightforward to navigate, so that if you get off the bus at a station you've never been to before, you can orient, you can see familiar signage that tells you, okay, if I need to transfer, here's where I need to go. There's something to orient you so that you're not completely lost. We know that so many users, they try something once, they get confused, it doesn't work, they're late getting where they need to go, and they never want to come back. So this is all about making the physical environment more easy for people to navigate and understand where they're going. And then lastly, connected. This is like, how are people able to access stations? We have a lot of, for example, light rail stations in the SACOG region where, the station is next to a freeway, and on the other side is a river, and it's surrounded by kind of an industrial area. And so even though, your job may only be a mile away, getting across all of those barriers to actually access your job can be a real challenge. And so thinking about how we improve those connections to get people back and forth from where they're going to the stations. So I won't go into a lot of detail again, but just summarizing some of the feedback that we got from the Policy Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee on this. And I would just kind of generally characterize this by saying a lot of excitement and interest around this from the Policy Advisory Committee. And I think some, general support for the concepts, but also, of course, concern about funding when we start proposing new things. Operators are just trying to cover their nuts and bolts right now. So a lot of kind of concern about funding constraints. The second major area is planning and funding. And this is, really about how are we sort of planning for a regional network in addition to the planning that was already underway at the local network for local networks. And so as part of this, we really feel like in order to position the region for funding, we need to articulate consistent and clear priorities across the region. And this comes back to how the operators are doing their planning. Right now, each operator's what's called their short range transit plan, which really lays out their priorities. These are not updated at the same time. They use wildly different formats. They are not, you can't put them side by side and understand how these all add up to a regional picture. And so we're recommending some changes to the planning process that are already being done elsewhere to, again, kind of standardize and harmonize those plans so that we can really see the picture as far as what the regional priorities are and then be better positioned to fund them. And then on the responsive, on the right-hand side of the slide, this is all about kind of tools, data, and analysis. Data costs money, analyses cost money. There's a lot of great data out there, but it's expensive, and not all the operators, frankly, like have the the means to use that, to get that data, to gather it, and to utilize it. So this is about supporting the operators in being able to have a better snapshot of what's happening, particularly again as we think about those travelers who are going long distances across the region, so that we can have the system respond to the data that we see. Again, a lot of strong support from the Policy Advisory Committee, for thinking about this more coordinated planning, and from the Technical Advisory Committee, a recognition that it would be helpful, but concerns about, creating more additional burdens in terms of more work for small agencies that have limited resources. And then on transit design and delivery, this is really all about where do we put transit and how do we get it moving faster. So this is thinking about, can we essentially build a network of regional express buses and transit priority lanes that cut across county lines, that are operating on freeways and major arterials that we know are heavily used, to connect all the different dots on the map, so that if you're going again from Roseville to Davis, there is a set of connections to get you there, and the roadway space that is necessary to move those buses quickly. There's been some work done to prioritize transit, and that can be inexpensive solutions like transit signal priority, which is really just changing how the traffic lights operate, all the way to creating dedicated bus lanes with inline stations. So there's a whole spectrum of things that we can do on the infrastructure side, but this is a really critical piece for speeding up transit. And then just making sure that we're using limited dollars to really support where the need is for transit. So targeting resources to the places where we know we can move a lot of people. So some recommendations around that. And then thinking about those places where, quite frankly, fixed route transit service doesn't really make sense. It wasn't making sense before COVID. It's doing even more poorly now. How do we think about leveraging things like Smart Ride in Sacramento, or the West Sacramento On Demand, these services that are using microtransit, using technology in order to, pick up passengers in places where, again, fixed route transit is just frankly not, not successful. So again, in terms of feedback, I think some really great comments that we need to think about as far as, again, with post-COVID, there's a lot of uncertainty about how commute patterns are changing. So I think one area is that SACOG could play a really supportive role, is coordinating to understand who's returning to office when and how that is changing commute patterns in the region. So kind of centralizing some of that data collection, and a recognition that cities, Caltrans, counties are really critical partners in the effort to speed up transit. And then our fourth and final section, before I hand it back over to Chris, is around reducing mobility disparities. And so this set of strategies is all about recognizing that we do have some pretty significant disparities in the region around, who has access to high quality jobs, who can get to where they need to go in order to get to work on time. And so the two components of this are around being more inclusive, so that we're really bringing more of the voices of disadvantaged travelers to the table, and utilizing metrics that kind of look at different planning opportunities through the lens of equity. And then trying to increase travel choice and reduce travel time and cost burden for those communities that we know that are most burdened currently. So looking at things like low-income discount fare programs, thinking about prioritizing speed improvements for transit along corridors that serve large numbers of low-income communities, and also looking at things like car share and micro-mobility to complement transit service in places where people don't own cars and where they're quite transit dependent, to give people more options if they need to get somewhere that frankly the bus doesn't go. And the feedback we've received on this area, there's an agreement, a lot of agreement from the Policy Advisory Committee about some of these needs. There's a concern from the transit operators about how we define disadvantaged communities, that it not be overly narrow. While there are some state funding, pots tied to a particular disadvantaged communities definition, want to be sure that we're thinking about disadvantaged communities in rural areas and suburban areas, that we're not overly narrow in our thinking about how we define disadvantaged. And then lastly, just a few thoughts on rural communities. These are the same strategies that we've already talked about, but kind of spotlighting some of the key challenges we've heard about for rural communities and how some of these strategies could be deployed there. So we've heard a lot about increasing access to medical facilities for rural residents. That can be a daunting challenge for folks. We think some of the new mobility, new technology strategies can be helpful there. Better access to rural job centers. Again, we think there may be some opportunities with demand responsive service to support getting people to and from rural job centers. There's a lot of new mandates like zero emissions vehicles, ZEV, that are difficult for small operators. So providing some on-call technical assistance to help small operators comply with those mandates. And then just a few other strategies to reduce the burden on smaller agencies and staff. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Chris, who I think wants to share a few more thoughts before we dive into your questions.
Thank you, Autumn. Yeah, I just wanted to say we look forward to your feedback. We have, as Barbara mentioned earlier, we have a possible opportunity, if the board approves, for some additional funding to move some of these initiatives forward, which is really exciting right now. So with that, just want to say thank you, and open stuff for any questions or comments you might have.
All right, questions from board members. And Jay, I think I see your hand up.
You do. Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. So thank you for the presentation. It's a lot of great information, a lot to dive into over time. I'm just wondering, in the work that you've done, did you include, or how did you include young people? And how are you thinking about that for the future, since that's really going to be the ridership of tomorrow? We got to get them today. So how does that figure in?
That's a great question.
It's my question all the time.
In our two groups that we had for the stakeholder groups, they probably were not as represented as they should be, and we can definitely address that as we move forward. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think that's fair. I will say we didn't do direct community outreach in the sense that we didn't hold public workshops, for this project. Instead, we chose to focus on, engaging the transit operators themselves, and then, representatives from business, community organizations, and I think as part of that, we did hear quite a bit about schools and access to schools, and how youth are a really critical constituency for transit, and how understanding, kind of as we go back to in-person learning, that's going to be a really critical piece of information. And also some of the feedback we've heard from the Policy Advisory Committee is how do we make it so that young people who start out riding transit don't feel like, as they become adults, if they want to have a good job and move ahead, that they need to buy a car, that they can continue to ride transit, because we're losing people as they kind of mature out and are get a driver's license and then get their first job. They're buying cars because they feel like that's what they need to do. So how do we kind of make lifelong transit riders out of the large number of youth in the region that are currently taking transit?
Yeah, so I think I would make 3 points. One is, schools are incredibly important, but it's not just about schools. It's really about also young people getting to work or doing whatever they're doing, and creating culture and habit at an early age, so we don't lose them as they mature out of riding public transit. I would point you to the evaluation that we did of regional transit for their ride-free RT, which does show a lot of that, and it shows where young people were using transit outside of school as well. And then the third thing, and James talked about this a little bit earlier, we do have the graduation of our Youth Leadership Academy. So not having to do a public community meeting, and I get that, but maybe trying to get some time with those young people who've been kind of working on these issues now for excuse me, a number of months. So you probably have a pretty educated cohort versus doing public meetings. So those would be my 3 points. But I just think even in your presentation, young people were nowhere to be found. And I just think we're missing the boat on that, because that's who we're building for. I mean, we have the immediate of what happens post-COVID, but looking in the longer term, we just can't ignore this whole generation, because I think the title here is Next Generation. So
there appears to be a big shift going on with regard to demand for office and office workers. I've heard a state estimate come out that say that maybe 40% of their downtown Sacramento largely workforce, so the state workforce, would not be returning to the office. They were seeking an alternative. When I was board chair at Regional Transit, essentially very nearly 100% of the monthly passes were purchased by state workers. So if you did some quick math, you could say you just lost 40% of your regular monthly passes, and that represents not only revenue but also a huge chunk of ridership. How do you see that playing out in terms of transit demand and even our transportation patterns? Because if you take 40% of the state workers off the roads out of transit, it really alters the transportation landscape out there. I'm wondering how you accommodate that in this process.
I think that's, I would agree. Those are some of the challenges we're facing going forward and some of the question marks. I think what we've seen in the COVID environment and from the data that we have been using to review over this is the big data package that we use, that's SACOG's data, excuse me. We found that some of the, even post-COVID, some of the long trips that were replaced by much shorter neighborhood trips, whether you're in a vehicle, bike, or bus. So we're seeing maybe if there's a shift in commute patterns, you still see a big demand on those smaller errand trips, neighborhood trips, that we might need to shift our models towards addressing those further. And what tools do we, in this plan is looking to what tools do we need to better address those now.
That makes sense. Paul, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can piggyback on your thought there, David. It actually was not going to be my initial question, but it seems to me that as a result of COVID, if we are reducing the number of people going into Sacramento to the workplace through these devices and remote working, we're actually accomplishing the vehicle miles traveled reductions we're looking for. But when you focus in on transit and how do we make transit successful, it's in conflict. And so we need to look, I believe, we need to look hard at what is transit. And this is supposed to be next generation transit that we're talking about. What is transit in the future? Does it make sense to continue doing what we have done and do it somewhat differently? What really makes sense? I almost would take a look at it from scratch. If we were to design a system today for the demands of tomorrow, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Not how do we expand the existing or alter the existing to suit a need. And so I guess with that, I can shift into what my actual question was going to be. There's a statement made of shifting land use to facilitate transit. And I read that as causing people to live differently so that we can make transit work. But I want to give Autumn and Chris the opportunity to dive into that deeper. If I'm reading that wrong, I want to know that. But if I'm reading it right, I want to know that too, because it really for what's considered a rural community like mine, that doesn't work.
Sure. And again, this was we were looking to, the study was trying to look at two different things, both how do we address the existing land use now with the transit options and service modes that we have at our disposal, and what can we develop in the future, but also using the policies from the MTP-SCS that is adopted, how does the region help to build in a fashion that supports future transit coming forward? So this plan is not proposing new land uses per se. It is leveraging the land uses from the adopted MTP-SCS that are more transit supportive, more infill focused, and things like that through larger portions of the region. But we are also looking at how to address the lower density, more rural areas with some of the service models that are emerging now through with our transit operators. A great example, and it seems to be the one we keep coming back to, is the more on-demand services, the Smart Ride and the VIA services. Yeah. While they are great to address some of these lower densities, suburban areas, and some other areas, the added benefit is they also provide data where people are riding from, where they're riding from and to. So we then, our transit operators and SACOG will have data then to help identify where maybe a new fixed route could operate if there's enough ridership to support it with that data that's coming from those models. So that's some of the methodology that we're applying through that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think somewhat it does. So I'm curious, as I'm going to give as example, recreation departments. In my city, our recreation departments used to provide a great many programs that have now been duplicated by the private sector. And we don't want to be in competition with that. So we've stepped away from a lot of those programs, and we have to reevaluate what makes sense. And if a government provided rec program continues to make sense, we evaluate that frequently. Do we do the same thing with programs like transit as the private sector moves into this space and begins to provide potentially greater mobility, faster and cheaper? Do we continue to evaluate whether a government provided system makes sense and to what degree it makes sense? Is that part of this next generation conversation?
Sure, and that's actually happening already at some level. We have a couple different of the on-demand services that are happening in our region that are operating under slightly different models. The West Sacramento model is happening in a different model than the RT Smart Ride model. So we are lucky that we get to step back and see how those two different models work. Plus, we have one of, at least historically, one of the highest performing micro mobility private providers in the country with the Jump services that have in our region. We're also able to see where we can combine those services and shift our transit agencies and our local jurisdictions into more mobility brokers to see how they can better address their mobility needs for their local jurisdictions through a wider suite of options they have.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Chris Ledesma, you're up next, but I'm reminded of the former mayor of your jurisdiction being here in this setting and saying, when you guys were talking about VIA and implementing VIA, that they'd done an analysis that basically said we could double our transit budget, run twice as many buses, double that operation and save a typical rider, 20 minutes, 30 minutes on their 1 to 2 hour ride, or 2 hour ride, I think was his example. Or we could do VIA for about the same amount of money and save 60% of the person's time.
Chair Sander, do you mind if I just make a quick comment on this? Well, because Director Joyner raised two really important questions here, right?
Go ahead, James.
About land use. One's about land use, and the other's about the private sector. And let me just address the private sector for a second. this is my opinion, informed opinion, experience. I think if we enter this next generation conversation, which absolutely is about what's 5, 10, 20 years in the future look like, which is harder than ever to predict, right? If we enter that conversation thinking the private sector can do it all, or we can actually do it all publicly funded, just as we've been doing, I think either one of those are not the right way to answer this question. We're I think trying to get to a place here where we're saying, how do we help our partners shift from a model of operating and running buses and trains to moving people? That's the first question. And there's a role, I think, initially right here in the here and now, and Chris just explained a little bit of this, for some contracting, for some VIA and some, for some private providers. But let's be eyes wide open too, that just on our bike share experiment and pilot in the 3 cities, they can be gone tomorrow. So there just is a really important, there's several important questions here that this is exactly why we wanted to bring this and have this discussion with the full board, because there's gaps, right? And we have to be very mindful of filling the gaps, whether it's, we don't want to have 2 classes of service by income. We don't want to have people pull out tomorrow. There's ways in which there's models, sometimes from other countries that are doing this before we are, of doing just contracting and working with vendors, I think, to ensure some of those larger public goals that Autumn and Chris laid out in this study can be met. Anyway, I just wanted to, I think these are excellent questions, and I wish the answers were simple, but we're trying to explore them.
It's not simple. They're really important, but it's not simple, that's for sure. So Director Ledesma, go right ahead.
Thank you.
You guys are kind of on point in some ways in this discussion.
Yeah, and in fact, in West Sac, we just had a conversation about this last night, and as we develop a mobility action plan that seeks to sort of bring all the services together in the various modes of mobility we have beyond just the bus service that we get from YCTD, which myself and Mr. Saylor play a part of as we redo that organization. So this is a very timely discussion, because in both those venues, both at the city level and at the district level, these are top of mind for us. We have to deal geographically with both in the urban area, which is my city we live in, and Vice Chair described it perfectly as we designed VIA for that, but we also have to deal with Winters and Woodland and that have some distance between them. And I think that does present the challenge. And I appreciate the comments, James, you brought up around what this is aimed for, because how do you get operators to sort of plan for the next gen? Which is a question we've been asking you, quite frankly, for the last few months and years, is a couple of years. I think that's the hard part about it, is opening up the district operators and even board members on that to think about to kind of think about these options. And there's no ready to go toolkit for operators to sort of go to. So if this effort is indeed to look at how do you plan for those types of being open to those types of models and those types of different modes that may be offered by private sector, which we have done through VIA, or by developing your own, which SAC-RT has done through their on-demand program. I think it's just really important, if this effort is there, done right, is to help steer them towards those planning, having those planning tools or resources for them to do that, because then you are reinventing the wheel by various operators individually trying to figure out how to do it. And a little bit, the part of the question I have on kind of what was presented today, and it kind of goes to Director Chenier's comments, was around the theme of the kind of the problem statement seems to be around long-term commuters, but it was just discussed that may be changing because of COVID related, the COVID outcome, which is we're all learning how to work from home. My employer, which is a very large bank, is really rethinking how the real estate strategy and office environment, and welcoming working from home. And I have an office in Roseville. I live in West Sacramento, and I haven't been to that office in over a year. And so it very much changes the dynamic of where we go. And so I just really ask to consider the short-term routes now, because that's the lesson for me, at least from VIA, that was really eye-opening to me, which is those routes aren't really routes. They're where people want to go, and that's what we're getting from the on-demand services. The fixed routes need to adapt to kind of feeding those places to go. And as you get into that data, I'm sure Chris knows it, but the thing that we responded to, and Dr. Chenier, this is where it ties to you, is young people use it more than anybody. Use our VIA program, and they use it to go to band practice. They use it to go to their sports team practices when their parents can't get home in time to take them. And additionally, it helps the elderly and to get around and have some independence. So again, these are all the theme of the PowerPoint and the direction seem to be solving for the long-term commuter question, and bus really relegated to bus service. But I see this being more dynamic now, as many of my fellow directors have brought up. It's going to be really tied to how do we create a web of mobility that people can get around more often. It's just something, a dynamic, I think, that's shifted right below our ground, or below our feet for the last year. And so anyway, just thematically, that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure we get real feedback. And it will take, I get the point about the private sector. I get it very clearly, because VIA already had a change that we had to adapt to in the last 2 years. But it is about being open to taking private sector solutions as an alternative, because the public sector, we can't adapt fast enough. So anyway, those are some of my comments and thoughts.
Very good.
And if may I just jump in with a couple of observations from the data that we looked at that I think help kind of inform this conversation. One is, you're absolutely right. When we look at the data around microtransit use, we see that microtransit use dropped off significantly less during COVID than fixed route transit. And I think that really speaks to what you're talking about, both that people are making shorter trips and staying closer to home. And I think there was also frankly a comfort level around being on a smaller vehicle, fewer people, et cetera. And at the same time, we also, in terms of the data that we looked at kind of pre and post COVID, we do see that there are still people riding fixed route transit, and they are the kind of the blue collar workers, the essential workers. And those people don't tend to be going just to downtown Sacramento, which is where we have more of the professional classes, right? And so as you talked about, we've sort of seen the ridership on the downtown Sacramento routes has dropped off a cliff. That's where the ridership has been the most dramatically impacted by COVID, because those are the kind of white collar workers, state workers who are able to work from home. The other destinations that we talked about on the regional map in terms of employment centers, there's a more of a mix of jobs, I would say, of kind of both blue collar, white collar jobs, people who do need to go in person. And so I think that you're absolutely right that the future of transit, none of us can predict the future, and we have a lot more data that we need to gather in the next year or two to understand how this thing is playing out. But there's going to continue to be a need for fixed route transit services to get people to their jobs who do need to work in person, but it may not be in the same places that people were working in person before COVID. And in addition, you're absolutely right, the local trips and getting people, like you said, to band practice, to the grocery store, to wherever they need to go in their community is going to be more important than ever.
Yeah, something to key down that is that we have learned. You just said that people have, they're responding to the VIA during the COVID. We're almost back to pre-COVID levels, which is amazing to think about. And part of that is they prefer the sort of smaller vehicle that we have, but we shouldn't let that. We're not dismissing that. People want to feel, whether they're in wherever they come from, in the low income areas or whatever, the quality ride is the quotient, the fact that they can get around a small vehicle and feel comfortable in that. That's earning rides. And so from a customer perspective, they prefer that ride. And that's something we have to listen to as well.
Director Branscombe, I think you had a question, or did you take your hand down?
Well, I did, and I put my hand down, but it's back up now. Thank you.
All right, there you
go. An idea that occurred to me, and it's different from BIA. I was just looking up and getting more acquainted with BIA. Is that the disadvantaged communities, at least I lived in Sacramento for 25 years, geographically concentrated. And I was thinking in terms of the cost for delivering a passenger from a disadvantaged area to whatever point they're going to, and comparing that to what could be done if, for example, to get around this resistance created by the 4 to 6 times difference in the amount of travel time, would be to, instead of having bus stops, or in addition to bus stops, have Uber stops or a Lyft stop, if you will, located around. And from there, the rides would be subsidized by RT. And I would, just off the top of my head, I would think, particularly if ride sharing, and they provide, and Lyft and Uber both provide for ride sharing discounts or sharing of the cost. If that was done, there would be a lot more choices in destinations. The time would be shorter. There'd be greater ridership. And I'd be interested in comparing the cost per ride compared to the cost per ride provided by rapid transit, and whether or not a subsidy would work and enhance the mobility from those disadvantaged and to those disadvantaged communities to those predetermined stops. Again, it was just an idea that occurred and I wanted to share.
Yeah, there have been some interesting studies on that point exactly. The one I'm thinking of is Cambridge, Massachusetts did this. It's probably 5 years ago. And they examined, how much money can we save if we start subsidizing Uber rides instead of running buses for everyone? And what they found was they could save, it was like 70 or 80% of the cost per ride by offering that partnership with the private sector. But what happened was people started taking a heck of a lot more rides. So as the service, improved, because now you didn't have the long commute or whatever, the long trip, now you had a short commute, people were using 3, 4, 5 times as much transit. So in the end, it was a wash for them. But if you think about the mission, I mean, if your mission is mobility, then that was a huge win.
Amen.
You just, particularly for the poor and disenfranchised, you just gave them enormous power to get around the region that they just physically could not have accomplished before.
Transportation power increases economic opportunity.
Exactly.
There's no question about it. And I think something like that might be worthy of an experiment or some sort of plan to see what the impact was and measure the impact, not just in, no, there's too many riders. The buses wouldn't mind if there's too many riders, but we shouldn't mind if there's too many riders being subsidized on Uber and Lyft. And then to see if the economic impact, of that increased mobility, if there was a measurable positive economic impact to that increased mobility.
Right.
Thanks for that feedback. I didn't think it was an original idea.
Well, I'm sure it's been tested. Actually, I'm also thinking of Centennial, Colorado, but there, I think it was paratransit. Oh, that may be a different jurisdiction. There was a paratransit study that showed something similar, where you could take 90% of paratransit riders and put them onto a rideshare mobility company's docket, basically, and reserve the rest of the agency's work for the most difficult folks to move under paratransit. And the savings were massive on those you moved off, and higher for those you kept. But in the mix of it, it was a net win. Certainly for mobility, it was a net win.
The trick is overcoming any internal bias there might be, institutional bias there might be within the management of the existing transit systems, because they have they have a hammer and everything looks
Yeah.
like a nail, right? And so it's a new idea, and it would conflict and might undermine some other budget considerations. But I can't get away from thinking it might work, and particularly for the disadvantaged communities. It could be a real uplifting experience, worth an experiment.
Director Branson, can I, and others, can I, one piece of math, and I think this is still fairly accurate, and Chris and Mike and Autumn, please correct me if I'm wrong. Even if you look at kind of the Uber versus a typical public agency, nothing beats a full bus. If you want to look at cost per rider, getting a bus full is really the way to go. And this is, I'm being really simplistic, right? And so back to what Chris and Autumn were setting up earlier, we should still be asking, how do we support our operators? How do we fill those buses? And part of that, I want to remind us all, there are things outside of our operators' controls. Speeding up buses, dedicated lanes, HOT lanes, right? Express lanes on freeways, we have none of right now. That's not to say that we think only buses and 40-foot buses are the only vehicle we should ever use. We don't. But I just want to do some math, and also just the challenges our operators are in right now and are actually trying to fix in the short term. They provide a really valuable service, and the more people you get on that bus, that cost per rider comes down. The cost per rider is typically higher on a microtransit flex schedule, but there are many places in a suburban region, I don't have to tell all of you this, that is actually the most effective thing you can do, right? From a customer perspective, a point to point. Chair Sandra, you were just mentioning the importance of a direct route or a one stop, right? To your job, to childcare, to the things you need to get to. And so, so that then becomes something that, again, we will have a workshop at the full board on this very topic. And I do think a lot of our transit operators are looking at things like smart ride, microtransit, point to point. So I just want to throw that in there that, our operators offer a good service when they can fill it and they need our help. And there are other ways in which we need to think about more flexible on-demand services. They will cost more because they will offer a better service. This makes sense. I'm trying to keep a little bit of the challenge on the table for us, and to have us understand that I don't think we have nearly hit maximum potential for filling those buses yet, but that's not going to work everywhere.
If I may, I've been around a long time, and I've heard, and I'm not diminishing what you said, James. It's just that people have been trying to do that for decades, in fact, generations. And in a region like Sacramento, where we don't have the density that you have on the East Coast, if you will, it'll be a challenge that I think requires new ideas. And people, they live under their own lamppost, and organizations such as RT will spend a lot of time looking at under their own lamppost. What's there? Buses and light rail. Well, new ideas are going to be what causes a breakthrough, I think.
I hear you, Director Branscombe, and I think that's, again, the spirit of this study. I'm just trying to put a shout out actually for some of our operators that are trying to test some of these ideas. And there's places like Houston and others where they've completely redesigned, and Sacramento, where we've redesigned bus networks and bus ridership has gone up. And you would appreciate this, right? Customer service, premium service, fast, reliable, safe, affordable. Anyway, I get what you're saying, and I think, again, this is the back and forth we want to engage you all on in many ways as a warm up to the board workshop coming, and then the implementation, the next steps on this study. So it's a great discussion. I really appreciate people weighing in.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging time for transit. As chair of the National League of Cities Transportation Committee, we hear an awful lot from transit operators and from peers like ourselves who run transit systems around the country. And I would have to characterize the majority of those comments as being the tyranny of the urgent, right? Like right now, I'm below my budget. My budget is breaking. I've got to get federal relief to save my budget. And it's not really about moving people. It's about, I gotta pay for these buses and the fuel and the drivers, and I've got to do these routes. And so all this like mental energy and focus is on the old way of doing stuff. And then somehow, someone said here, you know, the nuts and bolts of this, somehow you got to get past that into this innovation zone where you can actually try stuff. But if it's the tyranny of the urgent, the right now I'm not meeting my budget, can just wipe out any ability to do innovation. And of course, then we all lose, right? Because I personally don't believe there's a way to fund transit the way it used to be forever. That's a fool's errand. We have to come up with kind of revolutionary ways to do transit. We have to be willing to take some risks to do that. And it's going to be very challenging for agencies. I mean, even regional transit, that I agree in the past decade has really pushed to reinvent itself and do things different. I think even bigger steps are probably yet to come in that direction. And I hope this effort that we're putting together actually facilitates that and assists with that. I'd certainly think it'd be unfortunate if we lost this moment, this opportunity, because, you know, this is a bit of a crisis we're in for transit, more than a decade long one at this point. But this is a crisis we're in, and there are opportunities in a crisis.
Major organizations, the larger organizations get, typically the more risk adverse they become, and that gets in the way of innovation.
All right, other questions on this item? Comments? All right, very good. Let's see.
So David, just one thought, if I may, real quick.
Go ahead, Paul.
I would warn against the notion of creating future generations of transit-dependent individuals just so that we can feed this system. And I realize I'm reaching to an extreme here, but if you've got to evacuate paradise, transit isn't going to get you there. Transit isn't able to handle that. And when the system collapses, maybe COVID, whatever else it might be, you've left people who are now dependent on that system for their mobility, scrambling for options. So while I understand trying to build ridership and trying to build a customer base, I would warn against the mindset of trying to create generations of transit-dependent individuals. Just a thought.
All right. Do we have any public comment on this item? None?
No.
All right. Anything else? Anyone want to add anything else to this discussion? All right, Chris, Autumn, thank you very much. It's an interesting discussion. We are going to move on to our next information item, which is number 7. These are FTA 5307 and 5339 discretionary share evaluation criteria, and Barbara is back.
Good morning, Vice Chair Sander and committee members.
Or maybe not.
This is Michael Ralston, and I'm with the Transportation Group at SACOG, and I will be presenting this item on behalf of Barbara Van Beek. Just to give you a brief background, earlier this spring, FTA released the complete federal fiscal year 2020 and 2021 apportionments for Section 5307 and 5339 funds, which is allowing staff to move forward with programming activities. SACOG's programming role for these funds are for the transit operators and human service and nonprofit transportation providers within the Sacramento urbanized area. Back in March, the board programmed 88% or $26,770,016 of the available FFY 2020-2021 FTA 5307-5339 funds through this service-based earned share formula. And then a total of $7,156,930 or 12% of the 2 federal fiscal years, which are 2020 and 2021, remains available through the discretionary share portion. And the discretionary share process allows transit operators, the consolidated transportation service agencies, and as well as the nonprofit and human service transportation providers the opportunity to fund their capital and operating needs. Earlier in May, staff presented this item to this committee, and staff received encouraging comments and support for the proposed changes to the FTA 5307, 5339 discretionary share program evaluation criteria. And later in that month, staff met with the Transit Coordinating Committee to receive their input on those proposed changes. During that meeting, the transit operators raised some concerns about the changes, and some of those concerns, which were just addressed from the previous item on the next generation transit plan, and some of those concerns were on the process that is being completed for the next generation transit plan, as well as to see how the focus areas and strategies fits within the evaluation criteria. Staff will continue to collaborate with the Transit Coordinating Committee on the proposed guideline changes during the next coming months. Because the next generation transit plan is anticipated to be finalized this summer, staff will wait until the August board meeting to bring forward a staff recommendation that will include the input that's already received from the board members, as well as this committee, and the feedback from the transit and human service nonprofit operators, which is the TCC, for consideration and action on the updated Federal Transit Administration 5307, 5339 discretionary share program evaluation criteria. After the board acts on the discretionary share program, the transit operators, as well as the human service and nonprofit transportation providers, will be able to submit their applications to SACOG for the funding award considerations. As included with this item is attachment A, which is the drafted Federal Transit Administration discretionary share program evaluation criteria. Thank you, and I'm open to answer any questions on this item.
All right, Michael, thank you for that. Do we have any comments or questions? Looks like this is the way we could get to innovation. Funding mechanisms. All right. Seeing none, thank you very much for the presentation. Good to know. And James, if you don't have anything to add, I think we're moving on to item 8. All right, item 8 it is. And Victoria is coming back to us to talk about trails. Goals and outcomes for Sacramento Regional Parks and Trails Strategic Development Plan. And colleagues, I'm going to have to depart pretty quickly here. So Don, I expect you'll be finishing the meeting. Thank you for that.
All right, and let me get the presentation started on sharing. I recognize we are running a bit late in this meeting, so I will do my best to cover all of the highlights and not dwell on any of the logistical challenges too much. So the Regional Parks and Trail Strategic Development Plan is looking to envision the 6-county trail system that is going to connect communities to each other and really become a landmark asset in our region that people will be able to use for all kinds of different purposes. I wanted to give a quick overview of the most recent developments with the Parks and Trails Strategic Development Plan. We recently closed a public survey, and one moment, I wanted to go over some of the results from that, and then also who we heard from, because I think it is important to acknowledge both where we had strong response and then where we fell not quite in the area where we were hoping to. So we had 6,500 respondents, and proportionally the responses from counties was about what you would expect to see based on county populations. The one exception to that is that you'll see that El Dorado County had a higher response rate than Yolo County, even though Yolo County has more residents within the SACOG region. So that's one anomaly, but other than that, fairly fairly consistent. We had not shown here is the breakdown based on what cities people lived in. That was fairly consistent, although you would see as you move down the list that Elk Grove is the second most populous area in or city within the region based on the most recent ACS data or American Community Survey data. Yet Roseville, Davis, and Folsom all had stronger response rates than Elk Grove. And I think that could be a reflection of a more mature bike network in culture within those cities. So this is the smattering of the response rates. Okay, moving along. This is the distribution of who we heard from as was shared from respondents. So what you'll see is that we had a very strong representation of people who identified as white or Caucasian. This is technically an oversampling. About 69% of people who responded to the survey identified as Caucasian, whereas the regional numbers are closer to 51%. So we had an oversampling of people who identified as Caucasian, and also an oversampling of people who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. About 3% of survey respondents versus 0.5% actual. And that, I believe, is a result of some of the targeted outreach that we did to the Native American Health Center. We had an undersampling of people who identify as Latinx and Black. Both were at about half of the amount of their actual population within the region. And we were fairly close to on the mark for people who identified as Pacific Islander or Asian. Specifically, had about an 11% response rate from people who identified as Asian versus 13% region-wide. And for Pacific Islander, 2% response rate versus 0.9% of region population. So I realize that's a lot of numbers sent to you really quickly, but I wanted to go over some of this so you could see where there is a stronger response rate based on the self-volunteered information, and also the sort of person who says to themselves, I want to spend 5 minutes filling out a survey about where I would like to bike or walk to. Tends to be a little bit wider than the region, and then also a way to point to how targeted outreach does have helpful outcomes too. Okay. And the income distribution that was volunteered by people, none of this information was required to complete the survey. But for those that did volunteer, you have an oversampling of people that are earning $100,000 or more in the region. If you're going to compare it, this is roughly twice the rate of people who earn 150K or more, or earn between 100 and 150K. We were roughly comparable to the amount of people who, as a percentage of survey respondents, were in the 50 to 99K. And then we only captured about 1/3 to 1/4 of the population of people who are earning under 50K. So I want to be upfront with caveating where we saw higher response rates based on information that was shared as part of the survey. All right. And this is another interesting piece to consider about how survey respondents, where they were, where they're living, and how far they're having to go to the nearest trail. This is again based on where people said that they live from the survey and where people have to travel the farthest. And this also bears out somewhat with what we heard from respondents when they're marking their favorite trail, or what trails they want to get to. What we heard from people in Yuba County and Sutter County is a couple of instances of people saying they wanted more trails to go to, and some people identifying that there was only one trail for them to get to in the Bi-County area, and identifying that as the Sutter Bike Path. So it does seem that there's even within that some opportunity to promote the Marysville Ring Levee as identified by staff from that area. And though it may seem anomalous that there's a larger travel distance to trails within Yolo County, given the strong Yolo County bike culture, it's also worth noting that not all cities or areas within Yolo County do have many established or strongly connecting bike or trail networks. So I think that accounts for some of it, in addition to if there's somebody who's living in unincorporated Yolo County, there are only a smaller handful of established trails within those areas. So if we're looking at what people said was important to them for when they were saying where they would, what they like about existing trails and where they want to go to by biking, walking, rolling, etc. Very sensitive mouse. Okay, over 3,000 points were marked, and what we can see is that our existing trails that are marked as people's favorites, about half of them were identified as having great access to open space or to trees or scenic vistas. There was an article in this last month's Current that highlighted some of these findings, but where you'll see we're not quite meeting aspirations is that less than 10% of those were acknowledged as being a practical connection for people. So it was someplace where they could, have a lovely walk to get to the store. There weren't as many of those reported. There are still some, but there's definitely some room for improvement as a region. I should say though, people do love these outdoor spaces. They felt that it was, or they really valued how they were able to get into these safe outdoor areas that were free from car travel, and that they would have access to rivers or parks that they could take their family out. Those are all strong points for what our region has done well with our existing trail connections. So we were asking questions about where people would want to bike, to walk, or to roll to. We started with a general question just to get people thinking about what would you like to do? What are some different things? And we had a strong response for people saying that they're just looking for somewhere to exercise. And let me point out, people could select more than one option. That's why you can have 78% and 84% and still have that make sense. So many people are identifying multiple reasons and places they would like to bike, walk, or roll to. So a lot of people saying exercise, a lot of people saying fun, slightly smaller percentages of people saying like, yeah, it could be neat to bike to work or bike to errands or anything like that. And here we go again. this is the note of where people wanted to bike or walk to. So all of these are representing different pinpoints, and then there's the heat map of where they want to go and where there are heavy clusters. So there are a lot of responses. There are close to 12,000, but we were looking at not so much a specific, like, we must create trail connections to this area, but more of what is causing this type of destination to rise to the top of the list. So when you're looking at the specific reasons, you see fun surge ahead of exercise. And this may seem slightly disheartening considering you're hearing this from a transportation agency, but wait, I will get there. I promise. We noted that exercise fits in as a twofer for a lot of people. They see a way of biking or walking to somewhere as a way to get exercise and go shopping, a way to exercise and go to school or training, or exercise and work. You'll see that these proportions, both here and on the basic, where do people want to go? People are a little bit less interested in biking or walking to work. There are so many different reasons that can go into that. We've spent much of this exact meeting talking about those, but relative to transit with COVID, people are they're not as certain that they're going to need to bike or bike or walk to work as regularly anymore. There's a strong interest in increased teleworking. So it was not rising to the top of where people said that they wanted to go. And then similarly, you'll see that school or training is also not quite rising to the top. There's a continued challenge for people to feel safe with having their kids bike or walk to school. Most of the responses we saw zeroed in on concerns around vehicle traffic, freight traffic, all kinds of motorized vehicles that they viewed as threatening their children's safety. So we have that people view biking and walking as a great way to get exercise and do something else at the same time. And this, I promise you, is not a typo of a slide. They felt that fun could fit in with transportation when you're talking about biking and walking. So they wanted to get to their downtown areas for fun. So identifying First Street in Marysville, Vernon Street in Roseville, Plumas Street in Yuba City. Downtowns throughout the region were identified as someplace that people wanted to go for fun, often for dining and entertainment. They wanted to go to, they wanted to have a fun way to do their errands, like going to the grocery store or other social events, social expectations in some instances, if you've ever had to go to a PTA meeting or something to that effect. So they're looking at those in all kinds of different areas throughout the region. You could see Del Paso Boulevard being referenced as another place where people would want to go to a brewery, and they'd want to go to the salon as well. So they viewed being able to do a lot of different things at one place. And then very importantly, people saw this as an opportunity to overlay fun in transportation to spend time with friends and family. So calling out the barn here in West Sacramento, that's obviously an easy one. It is a pretty fun place to go. But people also looking at Main Street in Placerville, that they want to try out local eateries and gastropubs. Again, going to restaurants and events in Main Street, Woodland. and within Elk Grove, going or biking to different parks for 4th of July and other events. So these different places that support community, both community spaces, public spaces that people could be, and the places where they could go with their friends and family. And then you don't have to worry about, cleaning up your front room before you invite your friends over, because you're going to that other public space. And I did not provide the exact reference for this quote because really we heard it from every single place within the region that people wanted dedicated places for biking and walking because they did not want to either take themselves out or take their loved ones out on roadways that were not separated from the cars and trucks. So it was a resounding response from everyone within the region of all the different cities and unincorporated parts of counties and towns, and something that we could look to address through a connected trail network. So since this is not a scientific survey, and I acknowledge some of the different limitations of it, I'd also like to note that from the response rates that we did receive, we couldn't find any meaningful differences in the responses of where people wanted to go across income levels, across ethnicities, or really we haven't been able to find any across the geographies yet, but we are still looking to see if there's anything that really rises to the level of significance for that. But we're trying to present this information for you as ways that we have lightly shaped the goals and the ways of measuring those goals or achieving those goals in attachment B, which are the performance targets that could be used to support each of these 6 goals that we've been discussing with you for the past year. So within that, I'd like to turn more of the attention to what we have set in attachment B with the discussion targets, to review those for your input, for you to provide any further guidance you have as we move into the next steps of working with cities and counties and other partners to identify what this regionally connected trail network should accomplish and how we should go about approaching that. So a quick recap of what we're looking at within those. Within environmental justice as a goal, we are looking at seeking equitable trail access across households, regardless of income level or race. And this is based on what we've discussed before with the lower income households in our region having 30% less access to trails than higher income households. So that is one example of what we've learned from this trail outreach, from the review of the existing networks and analysis on what access to trails is like, and looking for what we can proactively look to achieve to make the trail network more equitable. Now, I don't want to read all of these to you, and I would like to hear what your thoughts are.
Very good. Thank you very much, Victoria. So I think we are asked to provide any input to staff on this topic. This is not a decision, which is a darn good thing because we only have 4 members of the board left. so we will not be taking any motions or considering them. I really appreciate the presentation that you've given, and it's very interesting to see the respondents, almost 7,000 people, took the time to fill out that survey. That's pretty impressive, and you've got some good information. Colleagues, are there any questions or comments on what Victoria has shared with us, with a focus probably on these 6 targets for performance? Okay, I think that means that we're accepting what you're telling us. I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand. I think that from my perspective, I think these are appropriate targets for us to be looking at in our continued conversations with the cities and counties, and to continue to engage. One question for you, Victoria. Is this the first time that this information as a result of the survey has been shared, and what other avenues of sharing with the community will you be doing?
Thank you for that question. We shared preliminary information about survey results with city, county, and nonprofit staff in mid-May. So your staff have all had the opportunity to discuss this with SACOG staff and to go over preliminary thoughts on it, which was also folded into how we shaped these starting draft / discussion goals. And also we are looking to do in July a more thorough webinar that goes over all of the outreach findings. And we'll record that, make it available on the website.
So this the presentation that you just gave us, is that going to be on the website? It was a late ad, so Jessica's nodding up and down, so that means it is. James, I have one last question for you, and then Gary Bradford has a question. But my question for you is on the timeline. Given what you've said about the motivation to be ready when the opportunity appears, do we need to adjust our timeline in any manner?
So that question, Director Saylor, I think what we need to do, and we actually have some money in this next fiscal year's budget to really build on so we got a trails plan. The next phase of the trails plan, to remind you all, is to actually work with all of your staffs, take the input we have, and build a regional trail network that connects to parks and open space and essential destinations together. We were thinking of a sequential add to this effort that would be a sort of a communications outreach, advocacy strategy next year. I would, just off the cuff, say perhaps we accelerate that piece if we can. We're very mindful of that. So I don't want to short the development of the plan, right? And the engagement and the local buy-in. That's critical. We do not want this to be the SACOG trail network. We want this to be the 6-county trail network. So that's going to take some time. But appreciate your question, as you know I would, on the opportunities. We don't want to miss an opportunity here and not be ready. So
okay, well, maybe we can look at ways to advance some, if not all, of the.
Yeah, I think we can be nimble around this. What was going to be a sequential piece if the opportunity presents itself.
Very good, Supervisor Bradford.
Sure. Thank you, Director Saylor, and thank you, Victoria, for that presentation. Just a couple quick comments, and then I think one quick question. So in looking through the items in attachment B, certainly what's under economic vitality, I think those are great goals. I think not only do they align with the presentation that you gave related to what people in the region are looking for, but I think they align with what my anticipation of what people in the region would be looking for. I mean, those two things, right? We want to access the nature that we have in the region, and we want to have walkable access to places to hang out with other people, right? And so restaurants and eateries, all those kind of things. And then in addition to the recreation piece listed under the next one. So my question is, under all ages and abilities, we have identified 30 miles of future parallel. It looks like it might be accidentally a duplicate of what's under safety on the document I'm looking at. Is that intentional? It seems like more of a safety goal than all ages and abilities. It says identify 30 miles of future parallel trail connections to bypass high traffic, high speed roadways.
They are viewed as distinct because you could just have one is the perception of safety, the one that is more about the all ages and all abilities, and the other is demonstrated safety risk. So within a high speed, high traffic roadway, there may not actually be crashes there, but it does not feel comfortable. It's not the sort of place that you may want to travel.
Okay.
Whereas for actual safety crashes, yes, there are safety crashes, or there are safety occurrences, there are collisions. Either you or a friend has, been involved in one. So that is the distinction between those two. And 30 miles is kind of a starting point. It's looking to add on beyond what we have already, because you could easily say the American River Parkway is providing close to 30 miles of that capacity to different roadways based on which segment it is. But not everybody lives by the American River Parkway, and throughout all 6 counties, people are interested in having a place to travel that is away from high-speed traffic, that is away from high volumes.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. That makes a lot of sense.
Very good. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you very much, Victoria, for this work and for the presentation. And I think that's the last business item that we have on the agenda. Mr. Corliss, is there anything further for the good of the cause?
No other matters.
All right. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. We're adjourned.